Hey, what is going on everyone? Mecha here and welcome back to another Fire Emblem character guide. Today we're doing a game that I almost overlooked for these, but thankfully did not. It's Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia. I'm going to cover both the Alm and Seleka route characters and go over just how easy they are to use and how you can best utilize them. More than ever, I gotta emphasize that every single character in this game is viable. The gap between the best units and the worst units has never been smaller in any game I've discussed. Because this game, first of all, it's just not all that difficult, and it also has a lot of opportunities for free experience. There's overworld encounters, there's dungeon encounters, and in addition there's a bunch of stat boosters you can give out, all those fountains you find, and all the stat boosting items. And weapons also don't have durability, so there's no drawback to grinding at all. You can get as much experience as your characters as you like. I'm going to assume minimal grinding, like you might make someone fight a couple of encounters to make sure they reach a promotion level, but other than that, I'm going to assume you're just playing through the game. And by the game, what I mean is Acts 1 through 5. I'm not taking into account Thebes, which is the post-game Act 6. I'm also not taking into account DLC, not DLC maps, and not DLC characters, because I haven't played with them, so I can't tell you how good they are. I'm not taking into account pitchforks, even though they're free DLC. In case you don't know, pitchforks will allow you to reclass a character into a villager, and then you can train him up and make him become just about anything. I did this with a couple characters in my Iron Man, such as with Valbar and with Bowie, also known as B. It was a lot of fun. I'm not going to take into account here because I think the pitchforks are kind of overpowered and they make almost any character good. So if you're wondering, is this character good with a pitchfork? The answer is probably yes. Some characters better with them than others, particularly the soldiers. Armor Knights do really well with them, but they work on just about anyone. So yeah, pitchfork character goes instantly into like good investment basically. But yeah, the gaps between all the different categories are smaller than ever. Shadows of Valentia has very few units that are actually like really good at base with no investment, but there are so many things you can give him, like stat boosters and good weapons, forges, just giving him experience in general, that it's really not an issue. So even the no-brainers need some investment. I just think they either need less investment or it's so worth it that they belong in a category above the just good investment category. The villagers, of course, they require a lot of investment just to get out of their base tier, or a bit of investment to get out. But again, they're worth it, so it's fine. They just require a bit more, how do I put it, a bit more guidance on like what they could be, because obviously they have all these different choices. Like Lucas just becomes, a knight, so you have no choice in the matter, but this is a bit more complicated. Doesn't mean that all these units turn out worse than a good investment, not at all. And then Flyer Temp Utility, these are units that, they're good enough for something at base without any investments. You can also make them good. It just takes, I think, more effort than the ones that are up here. But they have some utility on their own, either at base or with a little bit of investments that make them just fine. And then high effort, in this case Forsyth, I think he takes the most work out of anyone to make good for the least reward, but it still works. He's still a Forsyth to be reckoned with if you train him up, if you grind him a little bit. By no means does Forsyth turn out bad. I just think he takes more work than these guys up here, and he doesn't have any base utility that these units do. Similar things go for Seleka. I'll go over her list when I got it on screen. So let's start with the no-brainers. These are characters that I think anyone should use. Alm is the closest thing this game has to a Gaiden because he has a better start than most characters, and also because I actually don't recommend investing into him during Act 1 and Act 3. Because he becomes very, 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 very good in Act 4 and 5 without any help whatsoever. He promotes with an event on Seleka's route in Act 4, and then he becomes, promoted class. And in Shadows of Valentia, when a character promotes, it doesn't just give you a static bonus like it does in, for example, the GBA Fire Emblem games, where it's say you promote from Knight to General, you get plus 5 HP. Instead, in Shadows of Valentia, you are brought up to your class basis if you are below them. So, for example, if the hero base, which is Alm's promoted class, let's say it's like 40, it's not, but it's just an example, and he starts out at 20 HP, you don't train him at all, his promotion bonus just becomes 20 HP. So, in a way, your experience on him doesn't get used as efficiently as it does on other characters. So, I usually just don't give Alm very many kills. Now, don't get me wrong, Alm is very good in Act 1, and he can be okay in Act 3. But he's especially good in Act 1, and I recommend you use him whenever you think it's convenient in Act 1. Use him to kill things if you need to, use him to weaken things for other characters especially, something he's good at because he's not quite strong enough to one-round KO most of the time. He's very good, but I recommend giving XP to other characters because they have promotion levels to reach. Someone like Gray, Tobin, Cleve, these people, Cleve as well, Python, they need experience to reach a certain level so they can promote. But Alm doesn't have a level requirement for his promotion. He just needs Seleka to visit a village, and that's all she has to do. So there's no real reason to rush Alm's promotion because there's no way to do it other than just playing through the game. And that's why I don't recommend giving a bunch of XP to Alm. This does sandbag him a little bit in Act 3, but I don't think the difference is particularly big between base Alm and Alm with like 6 levels that you give him in Act 1, especially because your other characters will be much stronger as well. So don't get me wrong though, this is something that I think is good about Alm, the fact that he doesn't require experience to be good in Act 4 or 5, and is also really good at base. That's why he's a no-brainer. I just think that the way I recommend using him means not using him as much as you might be inclined to, especially because he's a lord, and he's force deployed in every chapter. I think Alm is very good, I just don't think it's worth training him for Act 3, because he doesn't really do anything special there, even if trained. But he's a very good character, especially in Act 4. He promotes to a hero class that has both swords and bows. He has access to a couple of exclusive swords, most notably the royal sword in, you get into Act 3 like halfway through, and if you use it enough, you'll get access to the double line combat art, which is basically just a double attack, a guaranteed, kind of like Hunter's Volley, if you're familiar with that, and it kills just about anything. Speaking of Hunter's Volley, Alm can also use the Killer Bow and learn Hunter's Volley himself. He doesn't have as much range as Bow Knight because his class doesn't have range +2 like Bow Knight does, which means Alm has, I think, 1 to 3 range, whereas Bow Knights have 1 to 5. So his Hunter's Volley is not as potent as the Bow Knights, or even the snipers, but it's still a very, very good power. The one drawback of the Killer Bow is, even though it has like large range, it doesn't have a healing effect stacked onto it like the royal sword does. So as he spams combat arts, he can fall lower in HP. But at the same time, I think the Killer Bow's advantages in positioning and also crit rate really help. Like the Killer Bow is a bit cheaper to forge as well than the royal sword. Like royal sword requires like 3 gold to get the full, and gold is pretty rare to find, whereas the Killer Bow is a lot cheaper. So I generally recommend Killer Bow over double line after having used both in a couple playthroughs. But you can't really go wrong with either of them, and I'd just make sure you use one of them, whatever you prefer. But I would recommend Killer Bow, Alm, and learning Hunter's Volley as soon as you can. Then you have Silk, and Silk is here basically on the merits of Warp alone. She starts as a low-level cleric, but if you can get her to, I believe, level 7 in Act 1, then she learns Warp. You can get it after that too, but I generally recommend getting it in Act 1 if you can, because it's pretty easy to do so. And Warp is great because you can move your characters, and in Shadows of Valentia, especially early on, your characters don't have a whole lot of movement. I believe almost 5, and then most of your other characters have like 4, unless you reclass them to something like Cavalier, which I don't recommend, or Pegasus Knight, which I also generally don't recommend for people who have a choice. So giving people more mobility is really nice. And the nice thing about Silk in Shadows of Valentia is that you also get access to another cleric in Fae. So even though Warp costs her a lot of HP to cast, because spells cost HP in this game, you can just heal her up and do it almost as many times as you'd like, and also get some XP that way. Also healing is just generally very good. Leveling up Silk with combat is tricky. Probably necessary because killing gives a lot more XP than healing. I believe healing gives you like 10 at most. I think it depends on the level a little bit too. But killing an enemy gives her like, I don't know, 30 to 40 XP depending on what levels you're talking about. And that generally goes a bit faster. It does come at the cost of XP on others. If you don't recommend going really slow, you could just like get her on there by healing alone. If you put Fae and Silk next to each other and just keep healing each other, the healing spell itself costs HP, so they have like an infinite healing grinding chain going on. Then you can just, keep that up until you've got either of them promoted or with whatever spells you want it. Again, I'm assuming not grinding, and I definitely classify this as grinding, but if you have nothing better to do with either of them, you might as well do that. Warp itself, unfortunately, doesn't give XP in this game, so that doesn't really help. If it was like GBA Fire Emblem, where she got like 60 XP just for warping someone, or like 85 XP, that'd be great, but fortunately it doesn't, because that'd be really broken. But yeah, Warp alone is worth. She also gets Invoke at a pretty high level, and she summons a bunch of, I believe she summons Dread Fighters. The fun thing about those is they don't die as quickly as everything else, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. I generally recommend weak summons, like the Pegasus Knights that Tatiana makes, because they die more easily, so they're better as baiting enemies away, especially dangerous enemies for your other units. So I don't like that Invoke as much, and it also comes pretty late, but it's something I should mention. No Physic, unfortunately, so she has to be next to someone to heal someone, which is why I really like Tatiana here. Because Tatiana is a later joining cleric. She joins basically, I wouldn't say it's late in Act 4, but it's definitely like maybe halfway through or so is a fair way to classify it, maybe almost halfway through. because you have to go to Mei Bowie's abode and then do the Zeke map. And then, I mean, she'll join you before the Zeke map, but that's like kind of late in the game overall. But I still think she's a no-brainer because her spells are just that good. Physic at base, and then gets Fortify and Warp kind of quickly, depending on how much you grind and how many XP wells you're willing to invest. And then she just pops off and does all the utility you ever want. Fortify is really nice in this game. People taking damage all over the place is very easy to cure with just one action. And Warp, I mean, again, mobility increase is fantastic. There are so many things you can do with Warp. I don't think I need to explain why just moving one of your characters like way ahead whenever you want them to, especially the less mobile characters that are very powerful, something like a Dread Fighter or Lucas, or I mean really anyone. It's just really powerful to have. So her spell is just very good, and yeah, I would definitely always recommend using the Saints in this game. They're absolutely great. Then we get to good investments. These are units that I think are good, not as good as no-brainers, but still worth investing in. You might question why I'm not just putting the Ram Villagers out here, but I think they deserve a category of their own because they require some more explanation. These are more straightforward characters with really only one path, not counting pitchforks. Lucas is a soldier promoted to a knight and then into a baron. He's a tank. He's just a really tanky character, high strength, high defense, high HP, and kind of bad everything else, but honestly he works with just fine. I find that Lucas, especially in blind playthroughs or playthroughs that are not optimized, Lucas is very helpful in Act 3, especially because he's easy to keep out of trouble. He just needs to stay alive, and he can do that just fine. Everyone else has a bit of trouble in Act 3 because you feel kind of unleveled compared to the enemies. But Lucas, as long as he's not fighting like an Arcanist with magic, he's generally fine just hitting things. You can use the Rider's Bane, which is a lance that's effective against horses. And if you force that weapon, it's very good at dealing with all the enemy cavaliers and paladins that you face in Act 3 and Act 4 as well. So I do recommend forging one of those and kind of sharing it between Lucas and the other cavaliers, paladins, lance users you might have. It's very good. Not too much to say about him other than the fact that if you do pitchfork Lucas, it's very powerful. Armor Knights and soldiers work very well with pitchforks because they keep the stats. I mean, everyone keeps their stats, but Lucas's stats in particular are very high in the strength and defense departments. You can turn him into like either a mercenary and then into a dread fighter later, or into an archer and then go for bow knight later. And having one of those classes with really good strength and defense is ridiculous. Like the archers that we have in this game, like Python and like your villager archer probably, and also Leon, they have a really good class, but they have pretty bad stats overall. It's just that killer bow, hunter's volley, and 1-5 range is so powerful that it doesn't matter. Now imagine having all those perks, but they're on a unit with actually good stats. Now that is absolutely busted. Not taking into account for his rating, but just something I thought I would recommend, because I'm going to bring it up for Valbar, because it's really powerful. But it's not within the scope of this guide, so I'm not going to cover it all over again. But yeah, Lucas is very straightforward, very tanky dude, chokes the points, good warp target, pretty good. Python, he's in here just by virtue of his class, like I said. His stats are pretty bad, especially his hit rates are very poor. He starts a bit on a level, I think his base level is like 3 or 4. Almost at the end of Act 1, there's like one real map to go, so if you don't grind him, Python is probably not getting anywhere before Act 3. He can probably still make it to Sniper, which requires him to be level 7. Probably by the proper start of Act 3 if you really want him to be. And he's just fine. Make sure to forge a killer bow is ASAP, because you can start on mastering it. You will want to have Hunter's Volley, which is a skill you pick up by using the killer bow, I think 20 times, which is, it's not super demanding because an archer can get an attack in almost every turn. Archer gives him range +1, I think Sniper gives him range +2, and then promotes the Bow Knight, and he keeps range +2. Killer bow is 1-3 range, so in total you get 1-5 range. Killer bow is massive crit, and then Hunter's Volley always attacks twice with increased combat parameters all around. It's a super good ability. Once you've seen it once, you will understand just how good it is, and why a character with Python, even though his start isn't that great, understatement of the year, even though his stats are pretty bleh, he's just that good. But early on you'll find him pretty frustrating. You have a steel bow in Act 1 that you can give to him, and the steel bow is like, it reduces speed a lot to the point where Python can get doubled, so sometimes it's actually better to just have Python hold food, or like an iron bow instead than the steel bow. I think it takes a little bit before you get an iron bow, so it might just have to be no bow, or maybe you do have an iron bow, but either way, the point is, sometimes not having him equipped with the best bow you have is the play, because he's just that fragile. But generally, killer bow, once you get that, you're pretty much solid. Especially because even before you get Hunter's Volley, Killer Bow is just a good thing to attack with. It has very high crit. Then we have the Paladin pair, the Gold Knights, and these are some of my favorites in the game when it comes to gameplay. Cleve has a deceptively bad start. I think people who play this game blindly and optimized just don't think much of Cleve because he leaves a very bad first impression. He gives bad unit feel, if you will. Because he joins in a map right at the point where everyone's accuracy get reduced by 20 because of floor tiles, and that makes Cleve look inaccurate, even though he's really not that much more inaccurate than everyone else. Like, even Alm and whatever your villages are, other than Mage, they will all have trouble hitting in that map, but Cleve, you know, he's new to the army, so people will think it's his fault. His stats are like not super impressive, but he does have basically the highest attack out of anyone in your team, especially if you give him an actual proper lance to work with. And he actually hits pretty hard. I would recommend having Cleve promoted by, if not one endgame, then at least the Act 3, because the Paladin promotion bonus will help him a little bit, and he just becomes more faster. I used to also recommend that you give him like a speed shrine to double certain cavaliers in Act 3, but I think that's a bit too specific for a new player guide. I'm just going to bring it up here, and it's also not as necessary for optimal play as it used to be, so whatever, I'm just going to drop it like that. But speed shrines can help him a little bit to become a bit faster, but it's not necessary for functioning properly. Again, another use of the Rider's Bane, which alone is pretty good in Act 3 because of the many horse enemies you face. And I mean, Cleve, again, statistically he doesn't look super great, but he gets the job done. He's a very good class, and Gold Knight promotion is more accessible to him than anyone else because of his level lead over everyone else. And I think he can get to Gold Knight pretty reasonably fast and benefit of the huge promo bonuses it gives him, because Gold Knight promotion bonuses, no matter where your stats are, they will make you pretty bulky, which is also what makes it so good for Matilda when she gets there. It's just a super good class with a lot of bulk and a lot of offensive power. He might not double everything, and sometimes he might look inaccurate, but it's generally not his fault. There will be other people with that problem. Don't expect like super amazing wonders out of Cleve, but I think for the amount of investment it takes to make him as good as he can be, he's pretty much worth to get up here. I had him in Inferior Temp Utility in here, but I was convinced otherwise. Matilda is a bit more investment heavy because she also joins as a paladin, I think at like level, pretty low level basically, for the time you get her at. It's like after the save fortress you get her. And she's the same Gold Knight like pros as Cleve does, just a little bit later. She's a bit more fragile in the paladin class. Her HP and defense are a bit lower, but her growths are pretty good, and overall she'll get by if you train her, but it does take a bit more effort than Cleve. But you know, she's also a lot prettier than Cleve, so people like her a lot more. I think that's really what it comes down to. If you get Matilda to promotion, she'll be pretty solid. Gold Knight is a good class. Did I mention that? I think so. Then we have the Ram Villagers. Now, Villagers are a complicated affair for optimization, but for new players, I just say you can go with almost any combination you want and probably be fine. The one thing I would recommend is making Fae a cleric and making sure they don't all have the same class. That's really the only way you can go wrong. But like, feel free to experiment, but let me just give some recommendations here. So I would always recommend having at least one mercenary villager because they get a really good sword in Act 1 called the Lightning Sword, and Alm can use it, but it's better to give it to someone who wants to get a lot of XP, which I've explained before is not Alm, and who can afford being weighed down by it. And pretty much anyone can do that. I've seen all three of these work as mercenaries. A lot of people go with Mercenary Grey, nothing wrong with it. I think super optimized play goes with Cleve instead. I think it's something to do with this higher resistance and then looping him back to Bow Knight. But Mercenary Grey is fine too. As long as you have one mercenary, you're solid. Another really good class for a villager can be Archer. If you want to have two Hunter's Volley bots in Act 3 and onwards, then having Python and a Villager Archer can be useful. It's a bit of work to train them, and the Archer class isn't very good statistically, so it doesn't always work. But it's never so bad that you don't want to have it, and they have a lot of opportunities for cheap shots. And once they do get a killer bow for themselves, and they can shoot someone with it, it's obviously worth it. So if you want to train up an Archer, an extra one, or you just don't like Python, if you don't, or you don't want to wait for Python and just get an Archer from the villagers. Mage, I think there's two schools of thought for mages. One of them is a long-term mage that, you know, you just use throughout the entire game. You just train them up from the start and you keep using them. If you want that, I would definitely recommend Tobin to be your mage, because he gets Excalibur relatively quickly. He gets Physic as a sage somewhere, and that's basically all of his spell list, but it works well enough because Excalibur is just that good. So if you want a long-term mage, I definitely recommend Tobin. If you want to use a mage as a temporary unit, so more of a fit-out temp utility kind of unit, you don't want to train one of the villagers long-term, but you do want to have a mage, which I think you do because the accuracy bonus compared to weapons, especially against enemies in one endgame with all the tiles, that gave extra avoid to enemies. If you want to ignore that and use magic to ignore that, which you can do, then I would definitely recommend making one of these a mage and just dropping them after Act 1 or so. Or using them as filler, but not actively giving them experience. Because this game does allow you to deploy everyone, but it doesn't mean you have to train and use everyone. You can just use units to set up kills for others, or to hold items for you, or to be shove bots, that stuff. You don't have to give everyone XP just because they're all deployed. I think that's a bit of a pitfall in this game, to think, okay, I have room for everyone in this game, so I should train everyone. I don't think that's the case. But yeah, so if you want a unit like that, for like a mage, and you can give either, generally the fitter mage of choice I think is Grey, but I think all of them can work to some extent. Sometimes people even make 2 people mages, and just you only use 1 villager. I think most people who play this game for the first time, they want to use all the villagers because they're some of the first characters you see, and I mean they're all really fun character-wise, so why not use them, right? So that's mercenary, archer, and mage covered. I wouldn't recommend going cavalier or soldier. I think you have the units you want in those classes already, and I don't think they're so good that you want to turn a villager into one. Cavalier in particular, it just takes a long time to get the paladin and gold knight if you're a villager. And in Act 1, there's not much of a use for a cavalier. Faye has a very different class path. She can go cleric, which I recommend because she gets physic and rescue in that class, and she can help healing silk, which is just very, very helpful. And I also made her a Pegasus Knight for my Iron Man because the chat voted it, and there was not a single map where I didn't regret it, because phase combat is not absolutely terrible as a Pegasus Knight, but I just really miss the extra healing. That's really the main thing. That cleric is by far her best class, and Pegasus Knight, it has some uses, as I'm gonna go over with Claire, but not enough to where you want 2 of them, I think. So yeah, not a super big fan of Pegasus Faye. She can go mage as well. She's not a terrible mage. Her like the attack stat is both magic and strength, so it doesn't really make a difference whether she is for her offense. And I believe she's like a fairly potent spellcaster if you want it to be. She's just not as good as cleric. But yeah, that's the Ram villagers for you. Fun investment units, but they do have some... you want to make sure that they work well together, that you don't just have 3 mercenaries, because you only have so many good weapons for them. Like, you only get 1 lightning sword, so the second mercenary usually won't be doing that much. And in the same vein, you only reasonably have 1 killer bow for Act 3. I don't think you can really afford to forge 2. So, like, 1 of Python and whatever you make your archer is going to be without a killer bow unless you manage to trade around very efficiently, which I think restricts your movement a little bit. So I usually say 1 of every class is a pitfall, but in this case I think it's worth not focusing too much on 1 class. Even though, like mercenary for example, you might think it's the best class overall, just make them all mercenaries, but that's not a good idea. So just diversify them a bit. But I gotta emphasize again, especially for the mill villagers, you can't really go wrong. Then we have the fillers, the temporaries, the utilities. These are units that I don't think are super good for long-term investment or pouring a bunch of XP into, but they can still be useful in their own right, and for some maps, it would be actually a shame not to use them. So Claire is a Pegasus Knight, and they have their occasional uses. This game doesn't have rescue dropping, which is the main draw for Pegasus Knights. I think of rescue dropping and then moving ahead and doing a bunch of combat. Claire's combat isn't too great in this game. She doesn't have the best stats, especially strength-wise, but she does use lances, and she can use the Rider's Bane, for example, or just like a forged steel lance or something like that. So there are definitely ways you can make Claire useful. Even if untrained, I think she's very good at using shove or swap just to get people ahead. Swap especially is usually kind of silly to use because you learn it by equipping a leather shield for a while, so you already don't get to use a weapon, which is kind of annoying for your combat. And then if you have like a 4-move unit using swap on someone else, they just move 1 tile back effectively to move someone else ahead. So you're not really gaining anything overall with your units. But with Claire, she moves further than anyone else because she ignores terrain and has more movement. So if she swaps with someone, she doesn't care that she falls behind a bit because everyone else is still slower than her. So you can just keep swapping every turn and give someone extra tiles. So that's like one of the closest things you have in this game to getting a movement advantage out of a unit like Claire, like not counting warp or something, which I think can be useful every now and then. For combat, I think raising her to be a Falcon Knight is a bit of a mistake. It can probably work if you wanted to, especially if you take grinding into account. But I don't recommend it as highly as I recommend training these other units. Then Luthier, aka the man of the easy pickings. He has Excalibur base, and that alone makes him worth deploying for killing armored enemies, the Save Fortress, and that map with a bunch of Barons in Act 4, I believe. There are a couple of those where just having extra magic caster is nice, especially when you have a magic ring around that you can just trade between several different mages. His kind of spellcasting power is nice. I think promoting him to Sage, I've actually never done it. I've played the game twice now on my channel, and I really like Luthier. He was a meme in both playthroughs, but it was just really hard to get him there. So I think he's not worth investing in long term, but again, doesn't mean it can't work. But Excalibur at base makes him like a good temporary unit at the very least. Delthea is kind of like a nuke version of of Luthier. I mean, there are siblings after all, so it makes sense. Delthea is very, very powerful. She has the Aura spell, does a crap ton of damage. And what I also like about Delthea is that her resistance is very high, so she can take on the many Arcanists that you face, and like the end of Act 3. And, well, at the end of Act 3 she joins, and then Act 4 you still face a bunch of Arcanists. So whenever you fight like a group of those, a lot of units, even good units like Lucas and Alm, they can have some trouble. But Delthea just takes negligible damage and takes him out, but she's also very powerful against Barons. Aura is a bit scary to use because it reduces her HP by a lot. Thankfully, a spell cannot kill you, but the damage you take by using a spell can be enough to set up a kill for an enemy, so you gotta be careful with her. When casting Aura, make sure you have someone available to heal. Mage Ring, very useful for her to make sure she can attack from a long range, and she gets a bunch of other cool spells, and like I think she gets Seraphim for monster encounters, so I like that a lot. And I think she also gets, there's like one more, I think she gets Ragnarok. That one is not as useful, I think, because she already got like a nuke and Aura. Although Ragnarok is pretty accurate, so that's pretty nice. She also uses swords after promotion, and that will stop her from draining her own HP. So you can give her something like, I don't know, a Blessed Sword, or I don't know, a Brave Sword if you wanted to. And it'll be good, because again, strength and magic are shared. This guy, I forgot what his name in this game, Zeke, there we go. He has like 5 different names in 5 different games. Zeke. He is a pretty good filler Gold Knight. You already have a couple, but if you didn't train them, then there's no reason not to use Zeke. And even if you did, he comes like basically for free. He doesn't double at base, I think not reliably, but if you give him a couple speed wells, which the Alm Route has a couple of, then he can double just fine. Give him something good to fight with, like, I don't know, some kind of Forged Steel Lance, and he'll be solid. He's got good strength, good bulk. You get the job done. He might even be better than a trained Cleve or Matilda. I haven't really gotten a whole use of that out of him in my playthroughs, but I've been told that he does pretty well as a temporary unit. He just joins very late. If he joined earlier, he'd be a lot better. But this list generally doesn't really take availability into account. It's just how much I recommend using characters. I just don't think they're as good as some of the other units you have later in the game. But at the same time, there's no reason not to deploy him. Same goes for Mycen, another Gold Knight at base. I find Mycen is like not super great in Act 5. He doesn't really double reliably, but he does a lot of damage. He doesn't really die very easily unless it's against an Arcanist, and he can be fine. It's just, he's usually not going to be better than someone you've really heavily invested in, I find. So that's why I think they're more filler, temporary, utility kind of units than actual like no-brainers. Like I've put units like Athos, for example. If he was as good as Athos, I would definitely just put him up here. I don't think he's that good. So, don't have too much to say about those. High effort, foresight to be reckoned with. Great meme units, great pitchfork candidate as well. My Iron Man, I just pitchforked him from, I think, Armor Knight to Mercenary and just turned him in. Well, Villager, made him a Mercenary, turned him up all the way to Dread Fighter. That was a lot of fun, but definitely the highest effort units on the Alm side, I think. I don't think he's that great at fighting for the amount of investment it takes. But nonetheless, I gotta stress, the gap between him and units up here is not as big as the gap between like FE7 units, for example. So if you want to make Foresight good, what I'd recommend is, just promote him to Knight and then to Baron. And then if you want to use Pitchforks, he's a really good candidate for it, because the Baron bases have really high defense. So whenever he promotes to that, regardless of his level ups, his defense will be good. You reclass him to Mercenary or to Archer, and you take advantage of really good stats. Or you can just use him as a Baron if you want. Don't use Pitchforks and just have another tank available. His speed growth is actually really good, so he might just double a couple things here and there, and he'll be fine. So not actually a terrible unit, just the one that I think takes the most effort to make good. And unlike these, he's not super good for anything at base. Like, he just joins a bit underleveled in the end of Act 1, so it's not like you just get a benefit out of using him for free most of the time. Of course, this guide would be incomplete without also having a Seleka route guide, and that's what this is. Basically the same structure. Units that are up here are highly recommended, and it kind of goes down But again, gotta remind everyone, the gap between the really good units and the really bad units in this game, I think is smaller than it's ever been, because really these bottom units over here, they can get almost as good or just as good as what you have up here, just with a bit more grinding, which this game is infinite of. So at the top, I got Jenny. She's not necessarily the best out of all these, but she's the leftmost, the one that joins the first. Jenny's of course up here because of her supportive utilities, things like having healing, physic, invoke, Seraphim as well for offense. Nosferatu isn't too good of a spell. It's like 2 weight and then 60 hit and then just no might at all. So unless you get lucky, she probably won't be very good at combat. But just the healing utility alone makes it worth a a top spot for me. She's also very useful in Act 4 for her passive healing, I think, because everyone next to her gets healed like 5 HP at a time, I think, which negates things like swamp damage, and it kind of does a number against AoE damage that you see elsewhere as well. So really useful character to have around, not necessarily to fight with her, but to make others better at fighting and not have to waste their time eating food or, potentially being in danger. And that's really nice. So she's basically the only healer that you have until you get some promoted ones. So she have to like get a big burn. I guess Seleka can heal as well, so that helps, but it takes her a while to get healing. Generally, your units rely on Jenny to stay alive, and that's why she's up here. Saber is a dread fighter. I haven't really gone into detail about why dread fighters are so good in this game. Like I mentioned, you should have like one mercenary and alms route, but I was mostly focused on lightning sword and its early game utility. I think Seleka route is a better example of why dread fighters are so useful and why you should have at least one. I think one is the optimal number, but I'll get into that. Saber is just the best of them because he starts at the highest level and he joins the first, so he's a good opportunity to explain this. So the first thing that dread fighters stand out in is just raw speed. They're able to double just about everything. You only need 1 speed to double an SOV, but that means you also need, only to be 1 speed below the enemy to get doubled. So it's a very two-edged sword in that way. Saber's never getting doubled, probably, besides maybe, I don't know, some enemy Myrmidons when he's not fully leveled yet or something. So, and he can double enemy dread fighters, and those are obviously very dangerous. One of the reasons they're so dangerous and why it's nice to have a dread fighter of your own is the dread fighter's ability to fight magical enemies like Arcanists, which you fight so many of, as well as Cantors. They both have magic damage done to them with their Apotropy ability. I don't know how to pronounce it, I never knew, I just called Applestrup. And then they also have Res +5, so really good against magical enemies. The one drawback that they have against those is they don't counterattack, so if you have a bunch of Arcanists, they will just be able to attack Saber without him doing anything back besides them taking damage from using their spells. So they're good for player-facing Arcanists, not necessarily great for just enemy-facing them. That's why Leon comes in handy. I'll get into him in a little bit. But it's nice to have one character that can assassinate these magical enemies on player phase safely without taking a bunch of damage. And it's nice to have him to enemy phase enemy dread fighters and, maybe not one round them, but get close. The other cool thing about dread fighters is they have access to a bunch of really cool and strong combat arts. The ones I have the most experience with that I like are the Zweihander, which has Tiger Stance, which is a combat art that does damage based off, I believe, your skill, and it's actually strong enough to one-hit KO some enemies. The other ones, they are less strong against more generic enemies because combat arts do not allow you to double attack. So Silver Sword has Roundhouse, which you learn after like a bunch of attacks. But the nice thing about Silver Sword is that it's cheap to forge, so it's a lot less expensive than the Zweihander. And then you also have the Brave Sword, which is just a really good and more light sword. I think it has 0 weight actually, and a really high crit rate. So all those swords are pretty good. Which one is best is probably up to personal preference. I've talked to several people about these swords and they all have different opinions. I don't think it really matters too much which one you use if you're like just playing casually. So I'm just going to recommend all of them, and hopefully you will find one that you enjoy. So good swords, good speed, and good against magical enemies on player phase especially is what dread fighters are good for. Now I think you should generally stick to one dread fighter. I think having 0 is a mistake, but I also think having 2 or 3 doesn't add too much. So I recommend picking one. If you get to like where Dean joins and you haven't trained Saber or Kamui, I do recommend using Dean. But if you have trained Saber, I don't see a reason to raise either of them. You could just use both for a little bit. They are both basically force deployed for a while because of a lack of alternatives. So I don't blame you for using multiple for a while. But once it's time to promote them to the dread fighter tier, it might not be worth to use all of them. You can still do it, and it's still fine. It's just you won't get much out of it. It felt a little bit superfluous for me. So one of those cases where one of every class might not be a pitfall. Next up is Leon, and obviously he's up here not because of his stats, but because of his excellent class and weapon type. Killer Bow, Hunter's Volley, Bow Knight, 1-5 range. I went over it before with the Villager Archer and Python on Yalmus, and it's no different from Leon. I think in fact he's even better. I think he's the best combat unit that you have on Seleka route just because of all those traits. It's just so good to be able to just delete enemies. Obviously, it takes him a little bit to get there, don't get me wrong. Like, during Act 2, he's mostly a chip bot. He can attack from almost anywhere, so there's no reason not to have him attack anything, and he's always able to get some XP for himself at the very least. But he's not the most accurate unit you have until he gets Curved Shot, then he gets very accurate. But it's not until Act 3 where he has access to a killable. What I usually recommend people do, or what I've decided is a pretty good idea after reading about it, is play Acts 3 first with Alm and have him get a killable, because Alm is pretty financially well off, so he's able to forge a killable without too much of a problem for his funds, and just have Python or your villager archer use it for most of the acts. And when you can, use a peddler to give to Seleka, and then it will just end up in Seleka's convoy. Leon can take it out and just start working on mastering killable himself, because he does need to, I think, enter 20 or 30 rounds of combat with the killable in order to get Hunter's Volley. And once he gets that, his speed basically doesn't matter anymore. He just doubles everything on player phase, and he can also counter enemies on enemy phase, and most of the enemies that want to attack him on enemy phase, he will double without the help of Hunter's Volley anyway. Giving him a Pegasus cheese or some other kind of speed boost will be really helpful, especially if you want to play the Beaufort, because the Beaufort is a giant pain in the butt, especially if you mostly rely on units like Pala or even Mei or Bowie. Leon is the only unit on Seleka's army that can counterattack pretty much every enemy there, one around them as well, and he has pretty good survivability too, as long as you make sure he doesn't take on more than like 2 or 3 enemies at a time. So his survivability is like good enough to where he can make more headway than if you just try to pick off all the Desert Fort dudes one by one, is what I'm saying, because not counterattacking is kind of cringe. But his accuracy will be a little bit shaky because of the floor tiles inside the fort. Other than that, it's just Hunter's Volley is really good. I just want to emphasize, if there's an enemy you 2-hit KO, you're pretty much guaranteed to do so, because even if you miss once, there's a high chance you'll just crit on the other hit. If there's an enemy you don't 2-hit KO, there's still a pretty high chance you just get rid of it, because 1 or 2 hits will probably crit. And even enemies that you don't even kill with a crit and a hit, there's a chance you'll kill them just through a double crit or something, like certain bosses or maybe armor knights or something. So it's always worth to attack Leon. Gotta keep his HP topped off, because Hunter's Volley does cost HP. But the combined utility of high range on player phase and enemy phase is just too good to ignore. Leon is really good. Late game, his low stats might show a little more than they did when he just got Hunter's Volley, but he'll be a strong contender for the entire game as long as you keep him safe. And one of the best weapons you have against enemy Arcanists, especially those that have more than 2 range, because it can be kind of tricky to get rid of those, but Leon's the best unit in the game against that type of enemy, and you encounter those a lot. So yeah, don't have much more to say. Leon is very, very powerful, and really worth the investment that it takes to get him to Sniper and then Bow Knights. Then there's Pala. I used to consider Pala like the best unit in the game, and after another run of SOV, I still like her a lot, but I like these other units a little bit better, especially Leon. Pala's still very good though, let's not underrate her. It's still a flying unit in a game with a lot of enemy like dense terrain. Pala is powerful enough to get a promotion in Act 3 if you want her to, or you can just train her along with the rest of your army. She'll still promote before most people. But favoring her a bit can get her ahead of the level curve, and she'll just like run right through, for example, Great Citadel, which is otherwise a pretty annoying map, but Seleka or Pala just destroys all the enemy, well, not the archers, but the skeletons especially she's very good against, because Falcon Knight has an effective ability against those. But I will say, after playing Gaiden, I think in Gaiden, Pala is much better than in the remake in Echoes. That was a bit of a disappointment. But generally, Pala just has good enough strength and defense to function, pretty high HP. She's got slightly lower luck and resistance than you sometimes want to, but other than that, she doesn't really have any major flaws. I guess lack of 2 or more range when she's using something like a forged steel or silver can be kind of annoying. That's why sometimes it's better to wait for Leon to do things than to just have Pala fly up. But against most of the 1-range enemies, she's generally fine with a bit of training. At base level, she's not super well equipped to handle something like an enemy Myrmidon. She'll get doubled and probably won't double in return, but if you've leveled her up quite a bit, even if she still gets doubled, her durability should be enough to withstand a couple hits. And in part 4, there's a lot of terrain around, so having Pala and Katria being able to fly over it, ignore swamp damage, and get to enemy cantors before they can unleash too many monsters can be pretty helpful. But it can be a little hard to get to the cantors themselves, because they summon enemies and then those enemies surround the cantor, and Pala can't reach him with a 1-range weapon, so you gotta wait until until there's like a turn where there's no monsters around him, which means basically just waiting for a turn where the cantor just doesn't summon. That can be a little bit tricky, but there's no doubt that Pala is one of the better units in Shadows of Valentia. Then we get to good investments. These are units that, they require some more work, but they can still work out quite fine. I think I said it before that units in Shadows of Valentia, there's very few units that require no investments. Like, you can't just deploy a base level Jenny or Saber in late game and expect them to work, and the same goes for these units, but I think they're just a little bit worse than the ones we got up here. So Mei and Bowie are very similar. I like them a lot more than I used to though. They are pretty good investment targets early on because of their high damage output once they've been trained, and favored, for example, by the speed or attack wells that are in the monastery that Seleka leaves from. And since you don't really have any great investment targets early on anyway, like Seleka, she's not a super great long-term investment in my opinion. Jenny doesn't really need the XP very much, so you can feed kills to either Mei or Bowie. I'd recommend using one, but not both. And they become pretty good. I used Mei in my last playthrough. I used Bowie as well, but I reclassed him, so it doesn't really count. I reclassed him with a pitchfork. But Mei is very, very strong, especially. She has a really high attack growth of 60%. And she's able to double quite reliably. The HP cost and a low HP on the mages in general can be a bit of a worry that makes them stop being they're not very great at being frontliners. That's why the joining of Saber, Kamui, Valbar is very welcome. But the 1-2 range and then occasionally the 1-3 range of Thunder on both of these is very helpful. In the long term, you can expect it to pay off. They use a sword after promotion, rather Mei uses a sword after promotion. Instead, Bowie doesn't really get anything in return, I believe. He has a lower promotion threshold, a lower level that he needs to reach, but Mei has an XP bonus that's basically the same. They can both heal after promotion, which can be kind of convenient. I find that their main strength is in Act 2 and Act 3 when they're raised ahead of the level curve. Act 4, they have trouble getting enough move to get to certain places, and other than a map like Duma's Gates or maybe trying to chip against Jeddah, I don't find they do all that much compared to units up here. But there are still spots where they can be very helpful. So overall, I'd say they are good investments. Kamui, I basically went over Dreadfighter with Saber. I don't think Kamui is sufficiently different to just explain it all over again. Their stats are rather similar. It's just that Saber has a level lead. I couldn't tell you offhand what exactly the differences between their stats are, but they're not very huge, especially considering a promotion to Myrmidon and Dreadfighter will give them the same class bases anyway. So any huge gaps between them due to one getting RNG screwed and one getting RNG blessed will probably be made up for a bit anyway by promotion. So use Kamui if you like his character better, or you just want to do something different than using Saber. I don't recommend pumping XP to both Saber or Kamui, but I went over why that is earlier. But Dreadfighter in itself is a good enough class to where I didn't feel like Kamui belongs in a lower ranking. But obviously, if you choose to use Saber, it might be worth to say, okay, Kamui basically belongs in here, filler, temp, utility kind of unit. But if you want to use Kamui, I think he belongs in good investments. Like, if you've made the decision, then he makes for a good investment by himself in a vacuum. Then there's Katria. Katria is interesting because she's basically Pala, but with a higher, a slightly worse start, but then a significantly better late game due to better speed, better res, better luck overall. Her stats are more well-rounded that way, and Falcon Knight in itself is still a beautiful class. It's able to fly over swamps and everything that I went over with Pala. All that goes for Katria, but Katria needs a lot more training. Her level is lower at start, and she does have better res right away, I believe, so she's able to do something like take on Sonya as a witches, or any random witches you can find to a better extent. Just don't leave her in range of the final chapter witches like I did in my Iron Man, and she should be pretty good, but I don't think she's S tier or no-brainer anymore or whatever. She's just a good investment target, but she definitely needs some work to get rolling. But it's all worth it. And it's not hard to set up kills for her, especially because the Falcon Knight and Pegasus Knight classes are so flexible, and they're able to go pretty much wherever they please. So training Katria is not hard at all. None of these characters are hard to train, but Katria especially is not. It just takes a little bit of work to get going. Dean, basically Saber with less investment cost, but also less availability. Saber you have for the entirety of Act 3 and Act 2, whereas Dean joins near the end of Act 3, and a couple levels, I think 1 or 2 levels below what you need to promote to Dreadfighter. If not 3 levels actually, it's level 10. So it takes a bit of XP investment or maybe an XP well somewhere to just give him that last little boost to get into Dreadfighter. But once he gets there, he's a fine Dreadfighter. Obviously, it'll still take some time before he's able to master whatever sword you want to give him. You could just go with the Brave Sword, the sword that he comes with. But for something like killing Jeddah, if you want to, it might be convenient to have something like Tiger Stance or a Roundhouse available, and it will take a little longer to get on Dean than on Saber or Kamui, because they've had longer to build up that kind of weapon, assuming you were able to forge it in time. But I believe you can forge those in Atlas's village, for instance. Speaking of Atlas's village, Atlas joins, I put him in the same kind of category as the Ram villagers, even though Atlas is a fundamentally different unit. But I still feel like he belonged in a tier between these two because he is definitely an investment kind of unit, unlike the people here who I just recommend using as a filler. And he doesn't really work as a temp unit, but I do think his long term is like somewhat worse than what we have over here. A little bit more work, I guess you could also put it. But I think he's just too good long term to belong down here. That's how I feel about it. So Atlas is a villager, but he doesn't join near any opportunities to promote him. Like at base level, you can promote to any villager class you want to, kind of like Grey in Alm's army. But the problem is there's no shrine nearby, no Mila idol nearby where you can do that. There's one like right north of his starting point, but the problem is if you go up there, he leaves your party, you have to go back and fetch him, and in the process you might have to fight like 2 or 3 extra encounters along the way. Like the stupid, what's it called? The thing. You also have to go back and get Pala and Katria again if you do that, because they also leave you, because they want to go for Great Citadel to rescue Est. So I generally don't recommend going north from that crossroads at the start of Act 3 with Seleka until you're done with Great Citadel. Which means Atlas would have to wait with promotion all the way there. So what I prefer to do with Atlas is, once you get him, go back down all the way to the Sea Shrine and promote him there, along with maybe Pala if you want to. Maybe Leon, but you probably already did that at the start of Act 3. You probably won't have him ready for Bone Knight by that time. So use the Mila Idol in Sea Shrine to promote Atlas. It will mean that Great Citadel, or maybe that Mila Palace Shaman guy, Cantor, summons a bunch of extra encounters that you have to wait through. So that's the opportunity cost of getting a quickly promoted Atlas. But on the other hand, Atlas is the only other option you have for an archer on Seleka's route besides a pitchfork. And those can be really good. Like Atlas can become an archer, sniper, get killer bow, hunter's volley, etc. It's most convenient you can have 2 killer bows, but you'll usually only have 1 to trade between him and Leon, and that can be kind of inconvenient. So I don't highly recommend it, which is why, again, he's not in good investment. Alternate classes I don't really recommend highly either. You could make him a mercenary, which, again, in a vacuum is a very good class, but you already have so many options for that, and I think having 1 is the most effective thing in Shadows of Valentia. So there's no real added value to just having Atlas promote to a mercenary. He'd just be worse, maybe not like completely worse than Jesse, for instance, but there's no real point to it. Mage is kind of a fun option for him because he gets Sagittae. That's really about it. I never really got him very high level in the last Iron Man I did, where I did make him a mage. He also gets rescued like high level Sage, but none of that is really worth it compared to Hunter's Volley. So I really recommend, bowing him down, like it says. Roll the title credits. So yeah, Atlas is not as great as these. There's an opportunity cost to using him and training him, but he does have really high HP and strength, and those are really the only stats a Hunter's Volley build needs. So he's very much made for the job. It's just getting him there. Defensively, he's a lot weaker than Leon, particularly because he gets doubled by literally everything. His speed is very, very low, so you got to take even better care of him than you have of Leon. But his HP is like a high buffer at least, so sometimes you can afford getting doubled. And Hunter's Volley is always worth it in the end. Okay, so next we have filler temp utility. Now, I've probably got to explain why Seleka, the force deployed unit all act long, is in filler temp utility. I talked it over with Rengor and we decided, yeah, Seleka, not really worth using or training for most of the game. When you have so many better units, and there's just not much that a 4-move unit can do with her, okay spell list and her mobility and her, lack of durability. She's just not very good at fighting things, especially not fighting a lot of things. Another drawback to Seleka using her is, of course, that if she dies, you don't get to use Mila's turn wheel. You just straight up get a game over. You gotta reset. I don't think that's an issue for most people, but that's one reason why I'd be hesitant to use her in an Iron Man setting, for example. That doesn't mean Seleka doesn't have anything to do. I think she's actually quite good in early Act 2. Her peak moment is probably the time where you have no one besides her, Mei, Bowie, and Jenny around, and then maybe Saber, because you pretty much need every all hands on deck at that point. Get it? Because it's both maps for the most part. And then you being able to learn Seraphim at a pretty quick level at the point where Jenny probably cannot unless you grind her a bit, and then being able to use that against the Sea Shrine Dragons. Those are Seleka's main selling points. But after that, Seleka just kind of feels bad for the most part. She doesn't really become a relevant and useful combat unit until you get access to a Mage Ring, which is, I think, late Act 3, early Act 4 at the earliest, depending on what you do with pedaling and everything, I believe. I don't remember the exact location of the Mage Ring, but it takes a while before you get it. Once you do get it, Seleka gains an extra bit of utility. She is able to use the Mage Ring to cast Thunder at 5 range, other spells at 4 range, and having that kind of range makes you useful almost every turn. It's the same reason why archers are pretty much handy to have around no matter what stage of the game, because they can always chip out somewhere. And Seleka, of course, hits on enemy resistance, which is pretty good. But the same risks apply. She can definitely die. But there are spots where it's useful, like being able to chip down Jeddah and his like little clock counter, for example. Those can be nice, but not so great that I recommend actually investing into Seleka. There are like LTC routes, I think, where Seleka is the main carry rather than Mei or Bowie. But I haven't looked into those like very in depth. I believe they're like viable, but not the best strategies ever. But for most players, those aren't really relevant. The point I'm making here is Seleka can work if you wanted to. She definitely isn't bad, but I don't recommend her as much as an investment project as the units up here. Valbar is the same thing. That might seem odd because I have a compilation of Valbar being super awesome on my channel, but that was with a pitchfork. Valbar is in an armored class. He is, an armor knight from Baron. And, that class is very well suited for pitchforks, but this list doesn't take into account pitchforks, and so Valbar is going to be assumed to be stuck as a armor knight or a baron. That's just a very low mobility class. Especially in Seleka's routes, he will be reduced to like 1 or 2 move per map or so. His tankiness is very handy early on, where you have easy choke points on boats, and not a lot of enemies are able to bypass, a 1-tile wide choke point, which is really what Valbar is. He will just be able to hold off enemies almost indefinitely. Minimum damage in SOV is 1, so he'll still take some damage, but it's like so negligible, and just 1 heal from Jenny will just top him off again. And that's useful, but it doesn't last very long, and at some point your other characters get enough durability or enough offense to stave off the enemies without his help, and at that point, Valbar doesn't really have much to do. So despite being a main character, according to Gaiden, he is kind of sidelined. And in some maps, honestly, you're better off benching him just to make sure he doesn't get like owned by a witch somewhere. Doesn't happen often because witches have this really weird AI, but that is one of his biggest weaknesses. I will say though, if you do have pitchforks, definitely try out Mercenary Valbar or Archer Valbar, because both of those builds are super amazing. The Baron has really high base defense and strength, and Valbar stats in those categories are just good, period. So if he's able to get the Baron and then reclass to a class that makes him faster or have better offense, which is Mercenary and Archer respectively, perhaps even both, like going Mercenary and then dread looping all the way back to Archer. All of those are fantastic options for a playthrough with Valbar. He's actually one of the best units in the game once he's been trained up like that, but not taken into account for this list. But yeah. Then there's Est. You might expect her to be in high effort. I mean, that's what the Est archetype is, but funnily enough, Est is more than just, low-level Pegasus Knight that needs a bunch of time to level up and gain, good stats. That can definitely be something you can do with her, and in that way she is a high-effort character, but I think she has more filler utility by using something like Leather Shield to swap people around on the swamp and give other people more mobility. That is something like what you do with Claire on Almstrad, I think, if you don't want to train her. Leather Shield requires like 5 rounds of combat, so it's really no skin off your back, and in exchange you get a Pegasus Knight that can help out low mobility units move across swamps and other places quickly without really impeding units like Katria or Pala. You can use them for swap utility too, but you'd probably rather have them attack, especially if you've trained them. So S is much better for that. I think the Sonion is like some kind of lance you can force that also does that. It has like 3 range or something. I don't remember offhand how good exactly the Sonion is. For what I remember, it's kind of a meme. But it's also something that S can do if you're looking for that kind of thing. So yeah, as a unit that you train up and like actively use for combat, S definitely belongs down here in higher effort. But this is something that S can actually do without significant investment. Then there's Conrad. First off, Conrad just joins like way too late to be like super useful. I personally just really dislike his character, but I'm trying not to take it into account here. He is a paladin at base, and that's like, it's okay. He joins like at the end of the swamp reign of Seleka routes, so I can't really blame him too much for being slowed down by swamps. I actually think he's remotely useful as a filler in the Dumas Gate map where there's not much terrain, and there are things for him to do like finishing off witches because his resistance is okay. But besides that, I don't think he's super useful in the tower, the Duma Tower, or in Jeddah's map or anything like that. And I don't think he's really worth raising up to be good. Especially because there's like just very few battles left when he does join, and in those maps he's just not very good. For example, the final chapter, there's too much swamp for him to really use his mobility to high advantage. So I don't think Conrad is very good, and his stats don't really make up for his shortcomings. But he's not so terrible that you wouldn't use him. So if you feel like he'd be useful for you in a map that you're currently playing, then by all means field him, and one of those maps is definitely Dumas Gate. Then there is Noma, there we go. That's Noma is his name. I was like, Noah, no, Maloa, no, that's all different kind of people, sages, whatever. Yeah. So this guy is, first of all, he's kick-ass beard, he's very old, and he's a pre-promoted sage, and he's kind of a secret character. In order to get him, you have to like go down the sluice gates with Seleka to find him. I don't know how he ended up there, but he did. And when you talk to him with Seleka while exploring, he'll just join you. And he's just, it's nice that he comes for free. He's not super useful for battle. His speed is way too low, and he's also a little bit fragile. But what I do like about him is he provides free healing. Just, you know, like a Jenny that doesn't have range, I guess. And he also has a funny Sagittae spell that does a lot of damage in one hit. It's not going to double because he's just not fast enough, but it has a funny animation. And you can use the mage ring, like you can trade around the mage ring between a lot of different magical units because they have a lot of flexibility in that regard. And you can just use that to get a bunch of chip damage in. Kind of dangerous to put him close to enemies because if you don't get rid of them, like all of them, he might die or get in danger. So you definitely have to be a bit deliberate when using him. But the fact that you don't have to train him up is very nice, I think. It makes him better than Sonya and Jesse. There's not too much utility for him in the game, but he does have some, and I think we should welcome it. There's not many units in this game that are useful, like from scratch, so I think we should appreciate him a little bit more. Now we have high efforts. These are units that I think are not very good. The first thing you might have noticed if you were like very passionate about that is that there's a huge disparity between Dina and Sonya. You can only recruit one of these characters, and there's some hot debate over it. I think there's no doubt in my mind that Dean is the better unit. If you don't need his Dreadfighterness, like if you already got a trained Saber or something, I can maybe say why he's passed him up, because you're probably not going to use Dean a lot anyway. But in a vacuum, there's no doubt in my mind that Dean is a better unit than Sonya, like absolutely none. Sonya, first of all, 4 move is atrocious, especially also in desert terrain. She doesn't, unlike a lot of other games, mages don't have full move in the desert, so that kind of sucks. Sonya's spell list is interesting, but a lot of the spells come really late. I think Excalibur is really nice, but then she also gets like Rescue and Rewarp very late. It's just too little too late. And honestly, Sages in Act 4 are kind of at their lowest point. Like even Mei and Bowie are not super great at that point in the game. And now you get Sonya near the end of Act 3, or maybe if you're being generous, halfway through, with a lot of levels to gain just to become another female sage. I don't think it's worth it at all, and I would not recommend training her unless you really like her for some reason. I can think of a couple reasons why you would like her, and I'm not going to say don't do it, but I'm going to say, you know what you're in for. It's going to be a lot of painful grinding. It's not hard to set up a couple kills for her, but doing it persistently throughout a whole playthrough without going back to grind somewhere, it's not fun. So I recommend you just get over some grinding somewhere. Go into like some kind of dungeon and grind him, or grind her. I mean, I was going to say the same for Jesse. He's an underleveled, I think he does join as a mercenary that you can almost instantly promote to Myrmidon. It takes like 1 or 2 levels, so that's not too bad. But then the road from Myrmidon to Dreadfighter, like getting him from level 1 to level 10, is a long one, and also one that I really recommend grinding for. You get him after the Bow Fort, I do believe, and that's a little bit more time than you have for Sonya, and by a little bit more I mean like 1 or 2 more maps, and that's about it. It's still possible, it's not impossible, but it takes a lot of extra effort, and I think there's not much that Jesse does to pay for it. His luck is much higher than a lot of other characters, which means he'll get more critical hits, and more avoid as well, which can be convenient at times, but it's nothing to write home about. It's not worth using him over Saber or Kamui when it comes to effort required. However, if you're like Bismix, you just like Jesse as a character, you know, go nuts, go grind him up. Save yourself the trouble of trying to train him in the maps alone, because it's going to take forever. Just grind him somewhere, and you'll be good. And there you have it. That's my opinion of all the Shadows of Valentia characters, and how to use them as units, I guess is a better way to put it. As I said, everyone in this whole game is usable as much as you'd like, especially considering the infinite resources thing that this game is going on. So use whoever you'd like, but some characters are clearly better than others. Hopefully, I don't know if anyone is watching this who hasn't played Shadows of Valentia yet, because I recommend it to everyone I bump into. It's a really great game, and I can't believe I missed it initially when like going over characters to put in a character guide. I hope it's been helpful to someone, but if you were just listening because you like my voice, you know, I appreciate it. And I'll see you for another game. Peace around and goodbye.